Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation from Tsao Foundation and also from UNSCAP. And I'm Shen. I'm very glad to be here to share some of my research about intergenerational transfers. So today my presentation will be comprised of two parts. The first is how the National Transfer Accounts, NTA, informs us of the resource flows across the generations. And the second part is about National Time Transfer Accounts, NTTA, tells us about inequality in the time transfer, in the inequality in the time spent in the unpaid work across age and also by gender, and how the family changes will respond to these inequalities in China. So first of all, I will briefly introduce what is NTA, National Transfer Accounts. So NTA stems from the conventional accounts, okay, and which mainly focused on the aggregate economic metrics, like we see the GDP, we see consumption, the compensation of employees, and also savings. But these conventional accounts lacks a very vital dimension, that is age. So it will mask the profound intergenerational imbalance. So NTA just fills up this gap and reveals the fundamental feature of all of the contemporary societies, that is the economic life cycle, which refers to the patterns of consumption and earnings across the age. And you will find that in most of the ages, there will be a mismatch between the material needs and the ability to satisfy these needs through your own labor. So if your labor income falls short of the consumption, then you are in a stage of deficit. But otherwise, you are in a stage of surplus. And these, like life cycle deficit, cannot be sustained without the two essential mechanisms. The first is the transfer, which is embodied in families and governments that could channel resources across the age. And the second is so-called asset-based reallocation that can be realized by the financial markets and can allow the resources to be shifted over time and also across the ages. So the ideology of the NTA can be expressed in this very important equation. So you can see the left-hand side of the equation is the life cycle deficit, which is the difference between consumption and labor income. And here I show you an example of the United States in 2015, and this also served as a great comparison for China, as we will discuss later on. So for the United States, you can see the left panel. Right, in the childhood and at the senior ages, people are in a stage of deficit. Consumption is higher than their labor income. While in the working ages, you are in a stage of surplus. And we also notice that the deficit is higher in the senior ages than that in the childhood. And this means that supporting or raising an older people is more expensive in the United States than raising a child. And the right-hand side of the equation is how can you finance these life cycle deficit? As we have seen that there are two ways. One is rely on the transfers, either this is public or private. And the second is the asset-based reallocation, that is the asset income, net of the savings. So also we take a look at the case of the United States. So in childhood, you can see about half of the deficit is financed by the public transfers. That means the government provide free education and also subsidized healthcare for the children. And the rest, one half of the deficit is financed by the private transfers. So the families are supporting their kids. Then in the working ages, you can see in the surplus age. So these working age adults, they are paying taxes and social security contributions to spend out this surplus. And also they are raising their family members. Then at the senior ages, in United States, you can see a large fraction of the deficit is financed by the asset-based reallocation. So that means the older adults, they rely on the asset income like the dividends, interest, or rents. And also they spend down their savings. Then also a large part of the deficit is financed by the public transfers. That is the pension benefits and also the Medicare in the United States. But if you look at this red part, that is the private transfer. You see, it takes the negative values for the younger, older adults. So that means those in the 60s, they are not receiving the money from their children, but actually they are giving the money to their children or even the grandchildren. So this is the downward transfer in the case of the United States. So how can we get all of these NTA estimates? So here I will not go into the technical details, but just to show you the general steps to get these estimates. So basically it follows 3 steps. The first is we will use the household survey data to estimate the initial age profiles of labor income, consumption transfer, and other economic flows, as we have seen from the NTA equation. And the second step is to calculate the macro controls using the system of national accounts. As we said that NTA stems from the conventional accounts, so most of the items in the NTA equation can find a corresponding macro control from the SNA. Okay. For instance, labor income has the macro control of the compensation of employees in the SNA accounts. And the third step is to do the adjustment. And here we will use the macro controls to adjust these initial per capita values. Okay. So if we find that the aggregate total from the NTA estimates, so that is the per capita values by age multiplied by the population by age, and then we sum across the ages, that is the aggregate total from the NTA estimate, is 110 units. 100 units. But the macro control from the SNA, like the compensation of labor, the compensation of employees, is 110 units, so that you will get the scaling factor at 1.1. And then you will apply this scaling factor to all of the per capita values by age. So with this adjustment, you will see the initial age profiles of NTA will be either shifted upwards or downwards, but the pattern of the age profile will not be changed. So with this adjustment procedure, we can ensure the consistency between NTA and SNA, and that would facilitate the macroeconomic analysis, especially for projection. So if we want to project the impacts of aging of the population on the future labor income, and with this adjustment, you can have the right starting values. Now we can take a look at the pattern for China. So for China, we have done 6 rounds of NTA estimates using these national household surveys. So the first one is 2002, then we have the 2007, 2010, 2014, 18, and the latest one was 2022. So the left panel is for the first decade of the century. And you can see the average labor income increased at an annual rate of 13.4% in this period between 2002 and 2010, a very strong growth because of the hyper-economic growth. And also another notable change over this decade is the peak earning age had dropped precipitously from age 41 years old in 2002 to only 28 by 2007. So 28 was quite young if you compare with the other countries. Just as we have seen for the US, the peak earning age was in the late 40s. And in Indonesia, the peak earning age was around 46 years old. But why China was so young? So there were mainly 2 reasons. One is the radical expansion of the college enrollment over the past decade. China's college enrollment has increased from only 1 million in 1998 to 5.7 million by 2007. So the rapid expansion of college mainly benefit younger population, especially the urban youth. So they can enter into these well-paid industries like high-tech industry, finance industry once they graduate from college. And the second reason for that is the massive urbanization process, which also took place from the late 1990s. You can see a large number of the rural young population in the late teens and early 20s. They moved to cities for employment. Okay, once they have finished middle school or senior high school education. So even though in the cities their labor income is still lower than that of the urban local residents, but it's already much higher than their parents or older brothers who were left behind in the countryside and mainly relied on the agricultural income. So you can see why in this transitional period, China had a very early peak earning age. But this is only temporary. So when a society becomes more mature, and you will see the contribution of the working experiences in wage will be more and more important. So by 2010, you can see the age have slightly increased to age 30. Then if you look at the next decade, you can see the labor income increased at a slower rate at 7.5% because of the moderate economic growth period. And also the peak earning age fluctuated in a range of 30 and 33 years old. And another change is that you notice a steeper decrease in labor income beyond the age 45 years old. Okay. So one major reason for that is the transition from the agricultural employment to the non-agricultural employment in the urbanization process. So people have to follow the rigid and also early retirement system in China. Like in China, the female workers have to retire at age of 50 or 55 years old, and the males have to retire at age of 60, very young. And this also indicates the age discrimination in the job market.
Now.
Then we move to look at the consumption change over these 2 decades. And in the first decade, you can see consumption increased at an annual rate of 12.3%. Okay. So this is high, but still lower than that of the increase of labor income. And if you calculate the average consumption as the share of the prime age labor income, that is the age for 30 to 49 years old, and China's ratio was around 38% in 2010. And this is also quite low as compared with the other countries. Like in the United States, the ratio was above 70%, and in Thailand in 2017 also above 70%, and in Korea in 2019 was 63%. So here you can see China still had a weak domestic demand in comparison to its labor income. And if you look at the age patterns of the consumption, so in 2002, this is a very typical pattern for the low-income countries. You can see there was lower consumption in childhood, and it's roughly flat in adult ages. So in 2002, you can see in China, raising a child is cheaper than supporting an older adult, a different pattern than from that of the United States. But things have changed. You can see from 2010, you will see there was a bulge in consumption in the youth ages. Then to the second decade of the century, on the one hand, you can see a sharper increase in consumption, and annual growth rate of consumption rose to 14.3% before the pandemic. So the share as the prime age labor income reached a peak of 50% by 2018, but because of the shock of the pandemic, there was a sluggish consumption, and you can see the ratio declined to about 42% again by 2022. And there were very notable changes in the pattern of the consumption, the age pattern of the consumption. By 2022, you can see clearly there are 2 peaks. One is in the preschool age, about 3 to 5 years old, and the second and also the highest peak was occurring at age around 20 years old. Okay. And we also calculate the cost of raising a child in China. We find that raising a child up to the age of 20 in China in 2022 would cost 12 years of prime age labor income. So this is very expensive, right? Longer than that of the other countries. And that is why we say that in China, having the kids and raising the kids is so costly. Okay. And further, we decompose the consumption by sector and by purpose. By sector means we distinguish between the government consumption and the private consumption. And by purpose, we means that we distinguish between the education consumption, healthcare, and the consumption other than education and healthcare. So here you can see different colors. So the double peaks in the consumption mainly results from the blue color. That is the private education consumption. You can see it's the highest in the preschool stage and also in the post-secondary education, the high school education, and the college education. It's very costly. And if you look at red parts, that is the public healthcare consumption, which has been increasing fast at the senior ages. And the increase was much slower for the private healthcare consumption, that is in the orange color. And if you look at the yellow color, that is the public education consumption, you can see it concentrated at school ages 6 to 22 years old, but we don't see much of the variation across the level of schools. Okay. And the largest part in this graph, that is the private other consumption. The private consumption other than education and healthcare. And you can see it's the largest for the younger population, aged 25 to 35 years old. So they have just finished the schools and they became a new consumption cohort. But if you compare this, older people, right? Even though many of the older people, the baby booming generation in China is also quite rich because their wealth has been exploding because of the booming housing market. But still, they are very thrift. They don't spend on items that are unnecessary. So you can see they still have a smaller private other consumption here. Okay. Now we will combine the consumption pattern and the labor income pattern together to calculate the life cycle deficit per capita. Okay. So you can see over these 20 years, the deficit increased dramatically at dependent ages, particularly in the childhood. It's getting more and more expensive to raise the kids. And also the range of the surplus changed. So in 2002, the surplus started from the age of 22 and ended at the age of 60. And that means a 22-year-old youth in 2002 could be self-sufficient. Their labor income can just cover their expenditures. Okay? And by 2022, you can see the start has been postponed to age 23 years old because of the expansion of college. And also, the ending age has been advanced to only 58 years old. So the surplus range has shortened by 3 years over these 2 decades. Okay? And if you compare, so from these figures, you will see that the real dependents in China are actually those below the age of 23 and above the age of 58 years old in 2022. And this is much larger than the traditional dependents we have used in our calculations, those below the age of 15 and above the age of 65. And now we also take a look at the aggregate values. So that is the per capita values multiplied by the population by age. And you will see that, even though the child population decreased by 18% over this period, but because of the sharp rise in the per capita values, so the aggregate deficit in the childhood still expanded. And for the senior agers, on the one hand, you can see a fast expansion of the older population. They get more than doubled over these 20 years. And also there was the rise in the per capita values. So aggregate deficit in the senior agers have also increased significantly. And if we add up these aggregate values by age, and you will get the national life cycle deficit in China. And in 2022, China's life cycle deficit was still negative. That means China was still enjoying the huge life cycle surplus. But many of the other countries, like the United States, they are actually running the life cycle deficit at the national level. So the next question is when China will run out of the life cycle surplus in the future in the aging process. So here we can do the simulation. So here we look at the 2 scenarios. The first scenario is we just assume the age-specific per capita life cycle deficit will remain constant over time, and the only changing factor is the age structure of the population. So in this case, you can see China's life cycle surplus will be exhausted in the mid of the century, so only 25 years ahead. And if you look at the blue line, and here we used age profiles of South Korea in 2019, and South Korea have a much stronger consumption. The consumption as the share of the prime age labor income was 63% in 2019. And in this case, with the China's population age structure, China would have run the life cycle deficit even at present. Okay. So how can we learn from these NTA estimates? We see that the aging population and with the earlier exit from the labor market and the rising consumption, that will speed up the depletion of the life cycle surplus in China in the future. Okay. So now we are actually faced with a series of dilemmas. On the one hand, we know that China since 2012 had been struggling with the shrinkage of the workforce population. So we used to have the very abundant labor force population, but now it's shrinking. But if you look at age profile of the labor income, you can see there was the steeper decrease in labor income at the senior ages above the age of 50. So you can see the older workers are actually marginalized in the workforce. So we have not made fully use of their human capital, their rich working experiences. And the second one is you can see the government has repeatedly stressed the importance of developing the silver economy, which has been the new engine for the future economic growth. But if you look at the consumption pattern, especially the consumption structure by age, you can see actually the older adults are still quite thrift. So they have the much lower private consumption as compared with the younger cohorts. So how can we better tap the potentials of these older cohorts to push them to make them to spend the money? And the third point is that, so if you look at the deficit, you can see there was a rise in the deficit at the senior ages. So they have to rely on other institutions to finance these deficits. And one important source is the public transfers. So it's very essential for us to unify and improve the social security system to eliminate old age poverty. But clearly, this will also pose great challenges on the fiscal sustainability of our social welfare system. Okay. And the last point is that you see that actually we are facing this intergenerational imbalance. So if you look at patterns, the age patterns, we feel that the younger population in China, they are much better off than the older generations because they are having a very high labor income and also they have the strong consumption. So is it possible that we impose higher social security contributions for the younger populations, particularly for the rich younger population? Say we might consider this tiered contribution brackets, like 6% pension contribution for the lower income groups, and then 8% for the middle class, and 10% for the top earners. Okay, but this may also have some side effects. This will lower the consumption potentials of these younger workers and may also hurt the economic vitality. So here we are faced with these dilemmas, and we have to strike a balance between these trade-offs, I think. Right. So this is for NTA. Okay. So NTA has told us this flows of the resources across the generations and the future implications of aging. But there is one big limitation of NTA is that it only takes into account of the value of the market labor. Okay, but we know that actually, people spend a lot of time in these unpaid work, like caring for kids, caring for the older adults, and also doing the domestic work. Okay, but all of these activities, they were undervalued in economic terms. So here we need this NTTA, National Time Transfer Accounts, which checks the time spent by individuals at different ages in these unpaid work using the time use survey data, and then we would assign a value to that work using the replacement wage for that service. So we can make these invisible work more visible. And this is also very important for the policy implication because it's gendered, right? You can see men and women specialize in different types of work. This is also the case for the Asian countries. You can see, the men make much higher labor income than the female counterparts. But if you look at this unpaid work, this is the reversed gender gap. Actually, the females made much more contributions in these unpaid work. Okay, so if we ignore these values, so we would underestimate the economic contributions of the females. So this is very important. So for China, we have like estimate, the time spent in unpaid work using 2 rounds of national time transfer or national time use surveys, one in 2008 and the latest one in 2018. Okay. So here we distinguish 2 types of unpaid work. One is the domestic work, okay, like cooking and doing the washes. And the second one is for caregiving. And here we include 3 kinds of caregiving. One is caring for the children, and the second is caring for the older adults, and the third one is tutoring the children. This is also very important. So you can see like in 2008, the men spent on average 123 minutes per week in domestic work. And the females, they spent like 6 hours. So the gender gap is 2.93 to 1 in 2008. And by 2018, you can see the time spent on these domestic work have decreased significantly for both men and women to only 90 minutes and 257 minutes. So that is because of the more prevalence of these like smart home facilities like dishwashers, robot cleaners, and also more families, they hire domestic helpers to do this work. Okay. And the gender gap also slightly decreased. But if you look at the time spent in caregiving, in 2008, men spent only 25 minutes per week, and the females spent 65 minutes. And by 2018, you can see, the time spent in caregiving for both men and women more than doubled, okay, especially in childcare. Okay. And also, the gender gap slightly widened to 2.63 to 1. Okay. And if you look at the time spent, like by age groups, you can see a more nuanced story. Okay. So that is for 2018, and the left panel is for housework. You can see, women spent much more time in housework and also in caregiving than the male counterparts at all of the ages. And for housework, you can see older adults spend more time in housework than the younger generations. And also the gender gap widened significantly at more senior ages. Okay. But if you look at the pattern of the caregiving, for females, clearly there are 2 peaks. The highest peak was in the late 20s and early 30s. So that is the time for childbearing. And the second one was in the late 50s. Okay, so the females, they have just retired and they became the major caregiver for their grandchildren. Okay. And the 2 peaks for men are later, one in the 30s and the other was in the early 60s. And also you can see the peaks were much less prominent than those for women. Okay. So there was a wider gender gap in the prime working ages at the age of 25 to 39 years old. So this just explained, has served as a very important reason for the gender gap in the labor force participation. Okay. So you can see this is the labor force participation by gender and age group in China. And between 1990 and 2015, so the labor force participation at younger ages, below the age of 24, have dropped significantly. But this is a good signal because that is because of the expansion of the college. But it's worthwhile that it's noteworthy that you see the female labor force participation at prime working ages, 25 to 44 years old, declined by 15 points over this period. But the male labor force participation only declined by 7 points. Okay? So there was a wider gender gap in employment. And economists have tried to find out the reasons from the demand side. For instance, they cite the reason of the replacement of the job assignment system with open recruitment and also the transition of the lifelong employment toward contract-based employment in the market reform process. But there is also one important reason from the supply side. That is the collapse of the daycare centers, which used to accommodate children under 3 years old and affiliated to the SOEs and public institutions. in the late 1990s because of the privatization of the SOEs. So that is why we have seen that women have to spend much more time in caregiving over the past decade. So that has resulted in the great waste of the human capital investment for the females. You can see that in 2020, actually, the gender gap in the college attainment has reversed. About 30% of the female youth in the early 20s, they have the chance to attend college, higher than that of the male counterparts. But still, like in the prime working ages, the females have the much lower employment rate than the male counterparts. Now we combine these paid and unpaid work together to see the gender gaps. You will see that except for the late teens and the early 50s, for most of the ages, the gender gap, the gender ratio, the female to male ratio in the time spent in paid and unpaid work combined is above 1. So that means for most of the ages, women have longer working hours than male counterparts. And this ratio is particularly high at the age of 25 to 39 years old. So you can see like the women at prime working ages, they are actually the most stressed out. So in this case, like how the women can deal with these like stresses and like challenges. In the lack of the inadequate like formal care facilities. So the females have to rely intensively on the families. So let's take a look at the changing families in China. Previous. And you can see over the past like 40 years, one notable change for China's family is we are having a shrinking family household. The average household declined from 4.4 persons per household to only 2.6 by 2020. So on average, each household will lose half a person per decade. And behind the shrinking household, you can see the changes in the household structures. So over these like 40 years, you can see on the one hand, there was a sharp rise in the one generation household from only 13% to about 50% by 2020. And especially for the one-person household, as mentioned by Professor Low this morning, you see, has increased from 6% to over a quarter by 2020. So that was about the level in South Korea in 2010. And at the same time, you can see the two-generation household has seen a sharp decrease from nearly 70% in 1990 to only about 1/3 by 2020. But if you look at a three-generation household, actually it's quite stable. The proportion is quite stable at the national level, about 16.5% before 2010, and had a slight decrease to 13.3% by 2020. So that is the national level estimate. And we further disaggregate the household size and household type by age using the census. So here we compare the situation in 1990 and 2010. And the pink color here represents the one-generation household. And the green one is the two-generation, and the blue one is the three-generation household. And you find that in 1990, about 40% of the infants under 3 years old were residing in the three-generation household. They co-reside with their parents and grandparents. But by 2010, you can see the proportion has increased sharply to 70%. And a similarly high proportion of the three-generation household was also observed for the youth in their late 20s and also the younger elders in the 60s. So actually, these three age groups comprise the three-generation household. And these three-generation household, they are formed, to take care of this, grandchild, these very young kids. And you also see that this is not a permanent living arrangement. This is only a transitional living arrangement. Because when a child gets older, say they approach the age of 3, they go to the preschools and then go to the primary schools, you can see there was a quick decrease in the share of the 3-generation household. Means that, when they get old, the 3-generation household will further split into a nuclear household and then a single generation old household. Okay? And also we find that at very senior ages, like at the age of 80s, the share of the 1-generation household and even the 1-person household has been increased. Right. So here from these patterns, you can see that families continue to offer the vital instrumental support for its members for the critical stages of life. Particularly, you can see the older people and also the females have made great contributions for the families. But here still we need more institutional support from the government side. One thing is I've mentioned before, that is to acknowledge the grandparents' contribution. Especially China recently has delayed the age at retirement for the males and the females, especially for the females. So in the future, there might be the conflict between the work and the grandchild care responsibility for the grandmothers. So we should offer them more compensations and more subsidies and more acknowledgements. And the second one is we can introduce the care credits in the pension system. So you can see the females actually spend a lot of time in caregiving. So they not only sacrifice their current earnings, they also sacrifice their future pension benefits. So maybe we can translate 2 years of certified caregiving to 1 year of pension contribution credits to acknowledge their contributions. And the third one is we can tie the daycare subsidies to the female employment. That means the full-time working mothers can receive more subsidies from the government, and the part-time workers, they can receive lower, but stay-at-home mothers can receive the lowest. That is to encourage the female employment. Especially you can see the females have such a high educational investment in their younger ages. Okay, so here are some of my discussions on this topic. Thank you very much.